welcome to the stage.
It's okay. I'll embarrass myself more than you did. It'll be fine. Hi, everyone. My name's Jarory de Jesus. I'm a technical narrative designer at Housemarque, previously a narrative designer at Respawn. If I'm looking at my phone during this presentation, it's because I took notes and I have bad eyesight. That's way down there. This is right here. So just gotta bear with me. A little bit of background on who I am. I have been in the games industry since 2017. I've got my bachelor's in anthropology from the University of Southern Florida in Tampa and a master's in game development from the University of Central Florida in Orlando. My first game project was Madden 20 after delivering this indie project called Scamp Hi-Hat Havoc, where I did most of the narrative design and a lot of the production work. After Madden, I moved on to Marvel Strike Force. I then shipped Jedi Survivor, and now I work on a project that I'm not legally allowed to talk about.
Interesting. Tell us more.
No. All right. So I'm going to kind of get into the meat of my talk really quickly. What we're going to go over is, actually, I think I skipped a slide. That's not here. Oh, well. Whatever. I'm going to talk about what I do as my career as a technical narrative designer and what it entails. Basically, as a technical narrative designer, my job is to build bridges between different disciplines. I am bridging the gap between narrative and design, narrative and tech, design and tech. And my goal is to be an intermediary for all three disciplines. One thing I do want to stress, I am not a programmer. I can code, and that's a benefit that I bring to the table personally, but usually you're going to be doing scripting work in this kind of a role. So blueprints, a little bit of C#. It's very rare that someone in this position should be doing C++. The fact that I do is just because I'm a nerd. All right. So what are the aspects of this work? The big, as you can see behind me, I can break this down into about 6 different categories. I work very closely with voiceover and story beats, scripting. Pipelines is a big one for me. So getting the VO from paper to audio to playing an engine, that is a long pipe. Let me tell you that. And my job is to set most of that up. Then, of course, there are technical assessments. So programmers, I love them to death, aren't always the best at explaining the limitations of what they're doing to designers in a way that is easy for designers to understand. So my job is often to translate what a programmer is doing and explain that to a designer as the limitation for design. And that's one of the big aspects of the technical design part of my job. And then, of course, I'm doing narrative design as well. So a lot of like high-level narrative beats and things of that nature, like, without going too much into what I do at my day-to-day job that I can't legally talk about, when I am helping set up a scene, right, the pacing and the framing and how good that scene feels to interact with, all the things that go into narrative design, that's a huge chunk of the work. Everything else is like cherry on top, basically. All right. So I've kind of broken this down, those 6 categories into, I want to say 3 broader strokes: the how, the why, and the what. And I'm going to dive a little deeper into each one of these. Basically, I believe that each category is its own unique aspect of the job, but it serves every other aspect as well. So when I dive into the code section, you'll see how I work very closely with code, but that code is informed by the narrative and it is informed by the design. They're not isolated from one another. It's a delicate ecosystem, so to speak. All right, let's get into the code part. I'm going to look more closely at my notes here because it's very small font. One of the things I try to say when you talk across the code is mind the gap. A good programmer really knows how to do their job, and you should never tell a programmer how to do their job, especially as a designer. That is like telling the audio engineer or the audio designer how to make the music. Don't do that. Just don't. What you want to tell them instead of how to implement something is what your needs are and how those needs better the project. So if I'm talking to a programmer about implementing a new dialogue tree system, I want to tell the programmer I need the tree to do this and this. I don't want to tell the programmer I think if you go and adjust this line of code, it'll make my life easier. That's kind of the difference there, right? Some general rules of thumb when talking between design and code. As a technical narrative designer, one of my primary jobs is to architect the tools and pipelines. And while I may do some implementation, the burden really falls heavily on the programmer to maintain that. So even if I set up a nice prototype, the programmer is going to be the one maintaining that code as the project goes on. And we really are letting other disciplines take the lead. A technical narrative designer is a support role. We're the healer on the team. And so if you don't main healer, don't do this role. That's I can say that. And it's important to remember when you're talking that not everyone is technical. So a quest or level designer may be more visually oriented and may ask for something like, say, a scene in an elevator. Now, if anyone in those rooms just had alarms go off in their head, good. While an elevator scene, maybe someone punching someone in an elevator may seem simple, moving surfaces with animations is not trivial. And a good programmer would know this and might say something along the lines of, that's going to be hard to do on a moving surface. One of my jobs is to find the solution and offer up ideas on how we could smoke and mirrors our way around that, right? So I might come in and say something along the lines of, does it have to be on an elevator? Does it have to be an action sequence? Can it be a cutscene? Does the player need to be in control? Stuff like that. Knowing what the design intent is from a non-technical standpoint can really inform how you communicate with code. Which is why I also say a technical designer or a technical narrative designer should probably never be the only designer in the room. Technical and technical narrative designers are going to be thinking along technical lines and may miss the forest for the trees, as the expression goes. I have my own understanding of what's possible and why, but a mission designer may have a more solid vision of the specifics of a given quest or level than I do. So I need to make sure that when there are conversations going around design, that all the appropriate parties are in the room having that conversation. So you want to include your stakeholders. You don't want to walk out of the room with one thing only for a key stakeholder to say, that's not what I wanted, right? So everyone should come around with the same takeaway and everyone should be like, this is what we want. If you can't have a stakeholder in the room, make sure you're writing down your conclusions. And the first thing you do before you start implementing is get that information to a stakeholder. Let them decide if this is what they want. It's very client-oriented work, no different than web design or UI UX, except your client is the creative director, narrative director, that kind of thing. But seriously, document everything you do. Even if you have the stakeholder in the room, document it anyway, because people forget stuff. So yeah, that elevator example that was totally hypothetical and would never happen in real life did not totally... Yeah, I'm just going to play the video.
Terrorist.
You gonna let him call you that?
That's enough.
So where'd you find him?
Night market. He was trying to buy a crate of electroproton bombs from a tracker.
That scene is like 2-3 months worth of technical work just to get him to punch him on the elevator without falling off. Welcome to AAA Dev, everyone. Changing gears a little bit, let's talk about story. As a narrative designer, as a technical narrative designer, you are a storyteller, but not always a writer. And there is a distinction to be had there. Story is an experience. It's the animation. It's the systems. It's time. Technical narrative designers are supposed to ease the burden on both the writer and the designer and provide estimates, not hard blocks to things. So one of the things I kind of like to harp on is if I am placing a line of dialogue and it doesn't feel right, it's not really my job to change how the dialogue is written. It's my job to collaborate with the writer and say, hey, this timing feels off. This feels a little wordy. Can we chop this down a little bit? And then allow the writer to express their creative vision as well. Again, this is a support role. And this back and forth isn't costly, right? But the story can be one of the most expensive parts of game development. While writing is cheap and fast to iterate on, The minute you introduce a new animation, a new dialogue system, or a new way to interact with the game, the complexity and costs go up. So as the manager or the owner of the story and its pipeline, my job is to keep that cost down. Part of the job of a technical narrative designer is being able to take over some of the simple coding tasks, but being able to clearly estimate and articulate how much a given story beat might cost. Don't get in the habit of saying no. Rather, try to provide the costs and let people who are stakeholders decide if they want to eat that cost. And it may cut another feature from the game. But it's not my job to decide what features go in the game and what features don't come out. It's my job to make sure the parts I am responsible for come out as polished as possible. And so if we have a really important story beat that involves, say, two characters kissing, we're going to maybe spend a lot of animation time on getting that IK to work between two different characters. And that might mean we don't get animations in a less important part of the story, but we will get that delivered on. And there's mocap and all that too. So like, obviously there are ways around this, but if you're doing like hand animation, for example, it's a cheesy example, I know, but let's just roll with it. One of the things you're also going to do is, say, a mirror. What happened? Anyone know? You see some people laughing here, right? In one of my projects, we have to do a mirror, right? And the story beat calls for it. So what do? Anyone want to take a guess what you do to navigate this?
You clone the character and then just...
That's a designer for you, everybody. Yeah, the point is reflections are costly. And so in this project, instead of actually making a mirror, we put the camera where the mirror would be and looked through the mirror. So we were looking back at the character, took camera control away. This is what I mean about finding solutions for story beats and owning those solutions. One of the major problems with this approach is, of course, it puts a lot of the impetus on you to solve other people's problems, but that's what you get paid for. So... you know, you got a job to do. And kind of to talk about pacing, I have one example I like to use. This is a mostly spoiler-free example. But in this sequence, there's a line that triggers when Bode, one of the characters you're seeing in the sequence, is approaching a through hole. What are these called? A squeeze hole. And there's a line that triggers when the enemy sees you. These kind of systemic lines can actually overlap with each other and interfere with pacing. And I found a video that actually showcases that. And these are the kind of things that a technical narrative designer is supposed to solve. And I have to admit, I did not solve this one.
They're onto us.
I dare you. I'm gonna take you out.
So you see in that example, right? There was no pause between those two lines because we had so many different systems. On this project, there were 3 technical narrative designers and 3 narrative designers. I was a narrative designer on this project, but I actually did this sequence, but I did not do the systemic combat lines. So not working closely with the people who were on that side of the equation is why we ended up with this kind of weird, almost incongruous, oh, that's a tough word, incongruous overlap of 2 lines playing back to back without any real breathing room between them. And this is one of the important parts of the job, right? Like a game of this size, you're going to not catch everything, but these are the kind of things that we are supposed to catch. Nope, go away. All right. Now let's talk design. This is, of course, the main discipline, right? This is the bread and butter. As a technical narrative designer, you are first and foremost a designer. This means using your skills to design some of the systems that help tell the story. An example might be Undertale's Mercy system, or the Confidant system in Persona 5. Both of these are story-driven systems that enhance the gameplay experience. In Jedi, one of the systems I helped develop were boss fight barks. I outlined places where the boss can make an interesting remark and taunt the player, and then I communicated those with the combat team to find out if there were any special moves that the boss might execute that would be really appropriate for that. And of course, I implemented those lines on once we had kind of a cohesive understanding of what we wanted to do. I also wrote a handful of lines for some of the small mini bosses, but none of the major bosses. But that was more because as a writer myself, I wanted to do writing, so I bugged my boss to let me do it. And anyone who wants to do both, I recommend doing that, right? Like, if you want to be both a writer and a narrative designer and you get hired for one, bother your boss to let you be in the room when the other is happening as well. I think moving laterally is the best way to progress yourself in the industry in towards of what you want to do. I started off as a technical designer and would not leave people alone until they let me sit in the writer's room. And then I would not leave them alone until they let me do narrative design. And now I'm a technical narrative designer. So just as a side tangent, back to the talk, the design role is, of course, communicating your design beats. So you'll need to do this with other designers and with code, as we've already established, but you'll adopt a different approach for each team. Designers may not use the same technicals, but you can utilize those cost estimates we talked about to kind of convey what goes into the feature. Conversely, with code, you might get more into the weeds of how things are done, but you may find yourself better served sticking to these high-level outcomes, as I kind of mentioned early. There's a tendency for people who are technical to get lost in the technical. One of my guiding lights is to say, like, does my boss, the narrative director, understand this conversation? And if that is not the case, I rein that in and bring it back to a level that is more abstract than the nuts and bolts of what goes into the system, unless I'm actually programming that system. Again, let the coders take the lead in these conversations. It's a lot cleaner and simpler to do that. This example that I gave, though, about the barks is actually something I can show you guys. So in this sequence, you'll notice that the ninth sister has a taunt after a specific moment in the fight, which then activates an ability. And one, she is in it's called the Mind Read ability, and she can dodge all of Cal's moves while in this state. If you attack her while in this state, it then has a % chance to trigger a taunt line. And so I'll show you guys that right now.
Usually Finnish internet is amazing.
I'm so disappointed.
I dare you. Take your shot. No way. Don't push me away.
So, a couple things in that sequence that were really fun to work on. She responds in the mind read state to the force push attack that Cal uses. And I find that was a really fun avenue to just showcase the character while at the same time having a system that felt more natural. These are the kind of tasks that you'll be doing as a technical narrative designer, right? Like, I didn't code the framework for making these lines fire, but I did go in and say, okay, this is a good example here, and this is a good example there. And that is the crux of this role, and that's kind of what I wanted to get at here. Stop that. Okay, so I think that brings me to the end of this kind of overview of the technical narrative designer role, and I am open for questions. This QR code will connect you with me. If you want to stay in touch, you can take my LinkedIn, my number, whatever, my email. Thank you. Hello.
I will kick off the questions for you with
No.
no. Oh well, yeah. So something that happens usually as especially when we get into the weeds of systems, lots of systemic stuff, lots of trees of if this thing, then that thing, all of these things. Have you found good ways to actually communicate these things with the rest of your team?
Yes. So if we're talking on a narrative level, like narrative systems, node graphs are great. So Artisy, Gem, Arcweave, these kind of tools. You can use them for your moment-to-moment dialogue, but you can also abstract them out to show like how things should flow. And you can do this on any systemic level. So if I want to say like it's basically a flow chart is what it is, but it allows me to add more detail and kind of keep it specific to the narrative in these tools. And I like to use that as an example of how to communicate these systems thinking. Design docs are great. They should never be more than a page per idea. If it takes more than one page to communicate your idea, you don't understand your idea. And that is...
Brevity is the soul of wit.
Exactly. I cannot stress this enough. If I can put the whole design on a single page, I will. That was one of the hardest parts about working at a AAA studio like EA or a massive studio like Respawn. There's an immense amount of documentation, and I have ADHD. I didn't read that shit. I'm gonna be honest. I learn best through experience, and so keeping things short, sweet, and simple when you communicate your ideas, easiest way to get through systemic problems. If you do need to get into the nuts and bolts of like, if this then that, if this then that, you're not thinking at a high enough level, and you want to take a step back, right? Each outcome doesn't need to be explored. You just need to know that there are multiple outcomes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of, yes. Any other questions? I'm gonna...
Hey, thank you for the talk. Very, very interesting. I have a question. You talk about how sometimes you have some kind of narrative point you'd like to push, and you communicate with the technical gameplay team to have that highlighted. In your experience, has it happened the opposite, so that the technological part of the game and the gameplay can push to some kind of narrative point that you would actually like to implement?
Absolutely. So this is more of a this is my personal project. In my spare time, I work on this hip-hop JRPG called Concrete Rose, and I wanted a system where it could explore different versions of revolution, peaceful and radical. And my combat system allowed you to take those different combat approaches, and that mechanic informed a lot of how the story I ended up developing. So it definitely can work in the other direction. It's a lot less common because systems take time to build. Narrative is the fastest thing you can iterate on. So you're usually working ahead of other teams, which means you're usually creating work for other teams. And a good narrative designer knows how to mitigate or minimize the amount of work they're creating cross-discipline.
Thank you.
Hi, and thanks for the talk. Really good. While you work through your career, you work on different roles, clearly on narrative design and stuff. Do you have any tips or strategies on because when you do a narrative stuff, you kind of take control out of the player, and they usually just have to watch, how to ensure the gameplay stays smooth because you work on those problems and how to implement them. So.
Well, it depends on what your objective is, right? If you want to build a Naughty Dog style game, does it really matter if you take away control from the player? They do it all the time, and it works. If you want to build a game that is less cinematic focus and more interactable, you have a couple different solutions at your disposal. The first is, of course, the painful QTE. Keep the player engaged by making the cutscene interactable. That is taking a sledgehammer to a small nail, though. There are a lot more elegant ways to approach this problem. One of my personal favorites is the Half-Life 2 kind of approach. You just kind of let the narrative play out, and the player chooses not to pay attention. That's between them and Gordon Freeman, right? The point is, if you want to keep gameplay flowing, keep your text small, right? So very brief, very short lines of dialogue. The player only needs to catch the critical information. Keep your interactions to a minimum. So if you're using like trigger volumes, for example, to trigger a line of dialogue, make sure whatever the audio source is can move with the player, so that it can. One of the most common things that happens is you get away from the audio source and the dialogue cuts off, right? Keep the audio source with the player, so like a radio or some sort of communicator that way goes a long way in these regards. And then think about how you want the player to interact with the story deeply. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but if you want the player to feel something, there's a moment in gaming that lives in my brain rent-free, and it's the original Call of Duty Modern Warfare after the nuclear explosion, where you are crawling to your death as you're breathing your last moments, and it makes you crawl. And that is one of the coolest narrative experiences I've ever had in any game ever. And if that's what you want your player to feel, do that. Does that help?
Yeah. Good one.
Yeah, I actually kind of wanted to follow up on maybe the very first thing that you said, which was sort of an offhand comment about the very long pipe of the cost of the pipeline of getting from VO to actual, in the game and all that. So in closer to the projects that I've worked on, the same pipe was super expensive because it had to do with localization, right? So then something that I sort of struggled with a lot, and I'm kind of interested in hearing your perspective on, how do you make it real to the people who are, say, generating dialogue or generating the story, the actual cost of the implications of the things that they do. So for me, it was, yes, I'll add these 5 lines of dialogue, and then like 14 languages later, it ended up costing a huge amount, but you don't necessarily ever notice as a person doing it. So you never get the feedback, and you're never able to be part of the solution, if you will, because you just don't have that experience. I'm sure you have analogs, so like, what do you do?
Localization is a tricky one because it's a cost you kind of have to eat depending on the number of languages you want. But as we kind of established earlier, keeping things brief is really critical. And as a director or a lead on a narrative team, being able to tell your writers say less is a really important skill. Right? If it takes more than 2 sentences to communicate an idea, ask them to do it in 1. See if they can. Challenge them. Don't say it's wrong. Just say, I like this. Can you make it shorter? Right? Encourage them and have your writers arise to the occasion. And I think that is one of the best ways to both lift up your people working under you while at the same time reducing the cost of the number of lines you're doing. That's been my experience anyway.
Fair enough. Yeah, nice.
Yeah, just throw it.
Yeet.
So I'm in a unique position in my own experience and
Sorry, go on.
of working for a company that's developing a game for a European luxury brand, and this brand is so wealthy that they have money to just like make a game, but they
How do I get in on that problem?
they aren't experienced with interactive narratives, and one of my biggest challenges has been, because they are very hands-on, helping to convey something beyond a linear narrative, which is easy to convey, and I've pitched 1,000, whether it's in theater or film or now in games. But for the uninitiated, I don't know if you've encountered trying to communicate like the power of choice and why choice design is so compelling, and why this is, it's not actually the narrative beat that's happening, it's the choice on offer that makes this beat compelling.
So I think with these kind of questions, it's always going to come back to the bottom dollar, right? So if you can make a case for how choice-based games have, or games with agency, I should say, not necessarily choice, but games with a lot of agency are outperforming games that are more linear, then you have a solid reason to kind of show them, right? Like, the problem with game dev that a lot of people don't realize is it is a business. As much as we enjoy the creative art side of things, we have to make money or we starve. So, boo me all you want. It's the truth. But understanding the business case for every decision and feature you're adding to the game carries a lot of weight, especially when people who have a ridiculous amount of money and no experience just care about how their money is getting used.
They don't even care how their money is being used.
Oh, then. Again, how do I get that kind of problem?
I don't have the money. I'm not getting it, just to be clear.
You spoke about doing one-page designs.
Sure.
So when these one-page designs, are these when you're seeking a solution, or is this at a system level? Like, how big or small are these one-pagers?
Sure. For me, one-page designs tend to be the most high-level designs I can show people. It is like the core essence of the game loop. And I may break that out into different one-page designs for different disciplines. So, like, my design for narrative may look a little different than the design for gameplay. So you might actually end up with 2 pages, but they're effectively communicating the same idea, just emphasizing different things in that idea.
Are you going to the photocopier and getting the A3 paper?
No. When I was in grad school, they actually had us, they graded us on our ability to do these one-page designs. And it was like a whole month of just this. And so practicing this will make it easier. The more you can, your one-page design is an elevator pitch of whatever the idea is, right? And you might have, for a larger project, multiple one-page designs for multiple ideas. But at the end of the day, each feature should be able to be described in a sentence or 2. And if you can describe it in a sentence or 2, you can describe it in like 2 images. That's kind of the principle there.
You mentioned like Persona and Undertale as two great examples. Would you give some other games as examples of what would be good mechanics to study if you're interested becoming like a technical narrative designer, for example?
Good examples of narrative systems in games. I mean, so I'll give you, it's actually easier to say games that are bad to study than it is to say games that are easier to study. Because, for example, I am enjoying Baldur's Gate 3. I would never recommend it as a case to study for narrative systems. They have built on such a strong foundation that if you are starting and that is what you are looking at, the hill and the delta between where you're going to start and where that ended up is so massive, you're not going to hit your target. Small games that tell really tight stories around their mechanics are probably the best thing to look at for starting. Persona 5 is one of my favorite games. It's also falls into the bad example category because it's so massive in scope. But if you can isolate certain mechanics in it, and you might be able to distill those down. Another really great example for me has always been BioShock. That game has it was one of the old like OG audio log systems, right? And then they also had a lot of the interactive, not cutscenes, interactive cinematic moments where like the Andrew Ryan speech and things like that. So, and they take away control at the one point where you'd want to control most, right? Like they do some really clever things in that game. So I highly recommend BioShock if you haven't played it. More modern games, I think I've begun leaning more towards games that use less words to tell their stories in their narrative systems, which is again why I look at like Baldur's Gate or Persona as bad examples, even though I love them and have a lot of fun with them. I'd recommend what is the name of the game I just finished playing earlier this year? It's escaping me. I'm sorry. Follow up with me afterwards, and I will go through my Steam library and get back to you. Haven't played it.
Hello? Yes, it works. Was that a game that you were thinking of Tunic by any chance?
Oh no, I haven't played
No.
Tunic.
Anyway,
I think we got
will
one.
sneak
We
that
had one
in
last question
quickly.
back
Yes.
there. Yeah.
Hey, thank you for the talk, and I wanted to ask, like as you said, a lot of these bigger mechanics or the systems actually take a lot of time to implement, and doing like narrative bits as in writing and iterating on those is easy, but how do you actually iterate on things that actually need the gameplay systems to work as you expect them? For example, those like, boss fight bits that the enemy is gonna throw at you. Imagine that, like, maybe if I want to base my whole game on that, how can I actually prototype if that works or not?
Yeah, I think any core loop idea should be prototyped before you even start prototyping your narrative features. And if your core loop idea is narrative driven, throw some lorem ipsum in there. You don't need actual text yet. Just make sure that things are firing the way you want them to, and that they feel good when you encounter them. Because the text you can iterate on over time, but you need to make sure your pipeline is stood up, and that's going to be where you spend the bulk of your time to start. Is like, how do I get from text to on-screen to spoken? There are some great tools out there that like you can use to get robo-voice, so you don't have to necessarily get voice acting if you plan on having voice acting later. That's a great place to start. If you have no intention of voice acting whatsoever, then you can just make sure this on-screen text displays when and how it should, and that like it feels good to read. The font is the great size, that kind of stuff. And those things are easy to tweak and iterate once you have them stood up. They're just costly to stand up.
Thank you.
Hello. As a systems designer, one of my biggest frustrations is pivots. And like changing the whole thing mid-production.
Okay.
Right?
Pivots, gotcha.
So I can only imagine as a narrative designer, it must be even more frustrating, right? Like that you have an entire sequence or idea or whatever set in a character, and suddenly marketing changes your character. Or, for example, in the boss fight you were saying, someone cuts an ability and now the boss fight is like transposed to the middle of the game or something like that, and the entire work gets changed. Do you have any tips on mitigating, besides like starting with a high level and then slowly getting into more detail, just knowing what's going to be subject to change and forecasting that, and avoiding those frustrations, basically?
I'm going to give you an answer you're probably not going to like, which is no. And not only do I not have an answer for that, I don't think that's the right way you should be looking at the question. The very first advice I ever got as a game dev was kill your darlings. Don't get so attached to any idea, any one system, any one feature that its absence makes you unable to make the game. There are times where production will come down and you have to adapt. On Madden, we had, I want to say about 10 to 15 hours worth of cutscenes that got cut down to like 7 or 8. And in that case, a lot of the story made a lot less sense. But at the end of the day, we had a game to ship, and that was the more important part, right? We had to salvage as much of that as we could and adjust. But if we had stopped to be frustrated at what was getting cut, that we didn't focus on what we needed to adapt to what was staying in, that game never would have shipped on time. That being said, if you want to mitigate the idea of having to cut things in the first place, flagging what you're unsure of when you're unsure of it and being honest that you're like, hey, I don't know if this is going to work, right? Flagging that could save a lot of people headache in the long run. But again, I really want to stress that the important thing is you've got to be flexible in this industry and you've got to be willing to let go of your own ideas. The last speaker had mentioned something like, someone might have a better idea. Champion that idea, right? Like you got to be willing to let go of your own ego and pride and be like, yes, this is a better way to do the thing, or this is a better thing to do. Let's go with this, as long as the cost doesn't stop us from shipping. And that's the important part.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Really nice points in the talk. So, in a team where there's no technical narrative designer, what would be the business case to get one?
You're effectively hiring someone who can do code, design, and narrative all in one. So if you want to make a business case, it's 3 roles. It's the work of 3 people in one. That's your strongest business case.
Yeah, that's absolutely good value. Yeah, thanks.
No problem. All right. Well, yeah, I'll leave that up there if you guys want to connect with me, and thank you.